Okay, guys. If you were to see down there, there are breakout rooms, right? And it says session one, session two, session three. So those sessions are based on the draws that Orcom released just now. So the judges are already waiting for us in there. So we're gonna enter in accordance with our session, which is in the draws. So yeah, good luck, everyone. relation as to their capabilities. So if they are unable to impose that much green technology, they're only going to do so insofar as it's comfortable for them to do so, like their economy can support that, right? Two burdens then. Number one, we're going to prove that as to why it's likely that these poor countries are actually going to suffer more if they don't do anything to curb the climate change. But secondly, that governments in these poor countries have a principal obligation to actually enact these policies. But a few responses coming from Gov's case. So Gov basically mentioned one thing as of now, right? That poor countries have a duty to actually maintain their development as compared to trying to curb climate change. So notice that there's two assumptions behind this argument. The first is that it assumes that you're going to sacrifice development to begin with. And up until this point, Atifa has given one line of analysis, which is that they have limited resources and they have to choose between development or economy. Relation as to their capabilities. So if they are unable to impose that much green technology, they're only going to do so also far as like companies. So it's not just going to be imposing green technology and stuff like that. But notice that there's a second assumption here, right? And this is the most important one, is that the argument assumes that climate change doesn't have an impact on the economy whatsoever. It assumes that even though all of the disasters are happening within these poor countries, it doesn't affect the economy. Notice that it does affect the economy because a lot of the times the economy is quite dependent on there being predictable climate. And as such, once the climate becomes unpredictable, this is when these poor countries are going to become much more economically harmed. So first argument then, why is it likely that the poor countries are going to suffer in the long run if they don't do this? First structural reason is that poor countries are going to be harmed the most. Why is this true? Two reasons why. Number one is that poor countries don't have the infrastructure to actually deal with the impacts of climate change. Things such as droughts, they don't have proper, like longkang and stuff like that. And things such as like famine and stuff like that, they didn't have proper irrigation systems in order to actually irrigate all of the crops that they have. But second reason is that oftentimes the economies are quite propped up by agriculture. This means that once their climate becomes unpredictable, this is when the agricultural sector is most likely going to collapse, and as such it's going to cause a huge amount of problems when it comes to the economic sector. Why is this argument very important, right? It proves two things. Number one is that the economy will deteriorate by virtue of them ignoring their climate change policies. And as such, this is particularly bad since given that they're a poor country, I'll take you at 6. Given that they're a poor country, it's most likely that their economy is the most important factor to take into account. Secondly, is that in this fight of climate change, poor countries are alone in this. Meaning to say that they're not going to get help from other countries, and as such, it's most likely that if they're harmed, they're going to be harmed alone. They're not going to get any kind of aid from other countries, and as such, the degree of harm that they're going to suffer is much worse as compared to a richer country. But sure, I'll take you, Atifa.
We only said that we will not give an obligation to these countries. However, they are still able to participate if they want and if it benefits them. Given that this is something which is not mutually exclusive to your side, what can you offer which only exists in your side, which will benefit this country more than us?
The benefit of having it and of putting it as an obligation is that now you incentivize further for any kind of policies which curb climate change, right? By just stating that they can enter, they can enact these policies if they want to, it's most likely that a lot of these poor countries are not going to want to enact these policies. But Hanani will get further as to why there's a principal obligation to begin with. Second structural reason then as to why they're going to be harmed way more in the future is that it's likely that they're able to make some kind of change within the climate itself, right? So this directly engages with the bulk of the case, which is coming from Gulf's side, that there's not going to be any kind of change. Why is this true? Number one, by sheer number itself, there's way more poor countries as compared to rich countries out there, which means that if all of the poor countries are imputed the obligation to enact policy which curbs climate change, you're most likely going to have some kind of material change. This also responds to the view I asked by Atifa as to what's the importance of imputing an obligation. Secondly, is that rich countries are already enacting green policies to begin with, which probably means that the amount of carbon which is being emitted into the climate is going less and less, but the ones who are stopping proper climate change right now is poor countries who are emitting a lot of carbon. Third structural reason is that green technology becomes more affordable the more that you use it. Atifa comes here and tries to paint that green technology is actually really expensive. It is true that it's expensive in the initial stages of implementing it, but the way that technology works is that the more you implement it, the more cheaper it gets, because research and development gets cheaper, and as such, the cost of that technology itself becomes cheaper. So the more that you implement it, the more accessible that it gets. Fourth reason is that policies to curb climate change also include setting up green company. We can see that this is the best case scenario for our side, which means that in the attempt of enacting green policies, you're most likely going to incentivize the governments of poor countries to set up companies which deal with green technology. And the thing about green technology is that it's quite profitable. This looks at companies like Tesla, and this looks at companies like Amazon, which enact solar panels within like America. And as such, this can bring in extra revenue into the country. The reason as to why this is important is that we prove that, number one, it's not a futile attempt, meaning to say that there can be some kind of material damage, material benefit. Notice that this directly engages with the burden that Atifa pushed to us, that there will be some kind of change. There is going to be some kind of change. But secondly, it also means that any kind of climate change, like benefit, is not something which is unattainable and far distant into the future. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the opposition leader for the speech, and now I would like to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister of the government team to continue the debate for their side.
Am I audible? Okay.
Yes.
So a country must do whatever it can to. A country must decide what is the right course of action in order to develop their own country and protect their citizens. But the opposition side tries to make it as if that focusing on policies about curbing climate change is the best course of action, the best choice on where a country should go to, a country should do to develop itself. However, this is flawful, and I'm going to prove it in my arguments. But before that, I would like to rebut a few points. First of all, the opposition side state that with applying more green technology, the country can like invest more, can improve themselves by applying by like an incentive of enacting more policies. But this falls under the assumption that just because we make one small policy, that country will like further explore into ways of curbing climate change. When in reality, these countries are very poor and would most likely just put that policy because people said that they should enact, and they will most likely will not focus more into that, and in the end of the day, that attempt in order to help solve climate change is utterly futile. And another thing I would rebut is that the leader of opposition side said that countries mainly rely on their agriculture, but that is simply not true. There are other countries such as Myanmar and India that does not rely on agriculture but production, and that simply they have to focus on production, and they focusing on climate change would actually be detrimental to themselves, and like it's like shooting yourself in the foot. So now moving on to my first argument, why the developed countries should be given responsibilities to enact this policy instead. So developed countries should be given responsibilities because they are more richer. They contribute more to climate change. Like we can see in the Industrial Revolution, like America got a head start on that, and in the end of the day, they are top of the world right now. They are economically, they are the way they are because they managed to have a head start and managed to pollute and cause climate change in the first place. And most developed countries, they are rich enough that they can balance both development of their own country and contributing to climate change, contributing to solving climate change. So, putting these responsibilities on countries that already developed are good because when that happens, this country it push the responsibility away from the poor countries. Like I've stated before, these poor countries can, but we say that they is not they should not. They should not be an obligation, and if they don't want to put it as a priority, they don't have to put it as a priority. But when that happens, the developed country instead have to put in some effort, have to put in more effort, because they are the one that is capable of solving climate change. And when that happens, even the outcome of their own policies can give a more effect than what happens when underdeveloped countries try to enact these policies. And this is important in the long term because then we are giving it a chance for these underdeveloped countries to focus on themselves and for them to focus on like their domestic disputes or domestic issues, in which after that then they can put like maybe after they have reached after they have reached a place of comfort, then they can start focusing on climate change. Yeah. Now moving on to my okay, wait, before that, NPI.
Yeah. Why is it that if we were to impute like obligation on poor countries to like enact policy, suddenly we're taking away the obligation from rich countries?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that when we oh, I'm s- I'm trying to make a point here where when you push that responsibility away from poor countries, they don't have to do it. When they don't have to do it, the responsibility falls on the rich country. And then these rich countries have to do it. And when they have to do it, they will put more effort rather in your world, opposition side world, everybody have an obligation. Thus, the rich country will just put simple policies because they know other countries will do it too. But in our world, poor countries don't have the obligation, and instead the rich countries have to. Thus, they have to put in more effort. They have to enact more policies rather than just putting it just to fit a quota that the world has set. And last argument is that uh, uh, poor, coun- poor countries are affected by climate change more worse than rich countries. This is true because they have to pay for healthcare. They have to pay for infrastructure that is broken. They have to pay for citizen for loss because of floods. Thus, putting that responsibility on this underdeveloped country, you are making them shooting themselves in the foot because they have to focus on two things at once. They have to focus on these policies that are quite costly, and they also have to focus on improving on how to adapt to this climate change. And it's very hard to adapt. Thus, it is important because it's important for us to acknowledge this because it's give an unfair standing towards this poor countries. You are giving a responsibility, the same responsibility that on the same responsibility on a poor country that a rich country should have, and that is simply unfair. Yeah. So in the end of the day, these poor countries have an option, a choice on whether or not to put climate change as a priority. Thus, go to side government because in our world we give these poor countries a better chance.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. Now, I call upon the second speaker from the opposition team to continue the case for their side.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes. Okay, I will start my speech in 1, 2, and 3. So, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you. I beg to the most honorable speaker, the wise son of educators, and everyone in this debate today. So I have two touch today, which is first, I will rebut the second argument from the government side, and I will give out our second argument from the opposition side. So moving on to my first task, which is to rebut what the Deputy Prime Minister just stated. He stated that the attempt of the poor countries to enact these policies to curb with this climate change just going to be utterly futile. But we see otherwise, because if you see that the rich country, the burdens fall to the rich country, so I think that these rich countries are willingly gonna help the poor countries. So as we can see today, it's like the poor countries stand by themselves. So if they want to focus on other development or curb other problems, such as like you said, the health problem or educations or anything, they need to curb these climate change problems, because in order to have the country have to good health on or anything, they have to focus on these climate change problems. So moving on to my second task, which is to give the arguments from our side. So the first argument from our side is the government's principal obligation to enact climate change policies. So governments have fundamental responsibility to protect their citizens and ensure their well-being. Addressing climate change is a critical aspect to fulfill their obligation to do so. So addressing this climate change, the poor countries, so that the poor countries can mitigate these devastating effects of climate change, because they are the most vulnerable one to the climate change. So we can see that this the government have the principal duty to do so, because they have the responsibility to protect the citizens. This is their principal obligations to protect the citizens. This is the one primary duties of the government to protect the safety, well-being, and rights of its citizens. So these poor countries don't want to die in the flood or in starve because of the drought. They want, their interest is they want to survive, or if there is any climate change problem. So government act as the representative of the people and accountable for their citizens. They are responsible for engaging in this problem and enact the policies to the so the government is responsible to ensure the needs and interests of the population are taken into consideration. So if you, it is their obligation to do so and to enact the policies. So the next is, we have two burdens that we need to prove today. First, if they don't implement the policy or do anything, a lot of people are going to be harmed. Second, because the society or the citizens is the one that elect the government. They vote for their government. So the government have the responsibility to protect the people from climate change problems such as flood, drought, and so on.
Right.
So the consequences, if the government enact the policies on curbing the climate change, as we know that climate change affects the poor countries more than the developed countries or rich countries. They exhibiting poverty, food insecurity, and displacement. So these nations often lack the resources and infrastructure necessary to adapt to and mitigate the impacts of climate change. So rising temperatures, extreme weather events, and sea level rise pose the threats to these vulnerable communities. So that is why they need to do something on the virtue of their country and the people. So yes, it's true that the developed countries and these poor countries contribute significant portion of global greenhouse gas emissions and so on. So the poor countries also contribute substantial amount. So they have to do something. If you are saying that it is gonna be the rich countries' responsibility, I don't think that if the poor country itself don't do anything, other countries gonna have the interest to help them. So it is crucial to acknowledge that even small changes implemented by the poor countries can have a substantial impact on curbing climate change. By taking measures like reduce emissions and adopt sustainable practice, these nations can contribute to the global effort in mitigating climate change and achieve more sustainable future. So the government is elected by the society or the citizens, and therefore has a responsibility to protect them from climate change-related problems such as flood, droughts, and other severe weather events. So governments hold the power to enforce policies that promote sustainable process. So they are the one, and they are in the power to do so. And if the government don't do anything, the individual itself, the society can do anything, because they are just a small community in this country. So the government are the one in power and the perfect one to do so. So citizens have vested interest to survive and to protect their well-being. They rely on the government to address climate change issues, as individuals alone lack the necessary means to tackle such complex and global problems. So the government as a collective body representing the interests of the people is in best position to enact the policies and mobilize resources and coordinate efforts to curb climate change. So as you can see, if these poor countries many poor countries rely on many natural resources. So if they do enact the policies to curb this climate change, these natural resources will be gone. So how can they survive? How about their economy and so on? So what immediate achievements, I understand immediate achievements may not always be apparent. It is essential for governments to take action for the sake of their country and citizen well-being. So even if the path to achieve these significant results may be challenging, the government's obligation to its people and the environment remains paramount. So that's all. Thank you.
Now, let's welcome the government whip to the floor.
Hello? Can you hear me? All right. So I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Okay. So as we have been through this debate, the poor countries, this house believe that the poor countries are now obliged to make policy to curb the climate change. All right. So what the second speaker have mentioned just now is that the government are trying to resolve the climate change issues for the citizen. All right. So if that's the case, why should the government should be focusing more on climate change? Since that poor countries such as like Indonesia or Malaysia, they have other problems to be more focused on. All right. For example, like the poor countries, they are struggling to fight for poverty, the corruption. So therefore, the government should also be focused on that. The government has less focus to be changed on climate change policy. All right. And the second thing is that the citizens work for the government, and I think that the citizens work for the government does not mean that the poor countries should be obliged to make the policy. All right. Since the citizens just work solely for the government, that means that the government should do something for the citizens in order to improve the country's development. All right. So since climate change has been affecting the poor countries, therefore that the government um, should be focusing more on the developing the country and also to provide for the citizens. That's why that making the policy for curbing climate change let's focus on for the poor countries. All right. And for my rebuttals are that why the poor countries are unable to make the required policies to curb the climate change is that the developing countries, since we have known that developing countries the major reason that they are causing the climate change, and so therefore the developing countries are put to blame that they are the ones should be focusing on making the policy to climate change. All right. The poor countries they are vulnerable to do that, so and therefore since they have more problems to be focused on, so the making policy to climate change is quite difficult to them and also very expensive, since that curbing climate change is very costly, but developing countries are able to do that. Therefore, the developing countries should make the policies. Meanwhile, the poor countries are vulnerable to do it, so they cannot do it. Right. All right. So the second speaker have said that the government protect the citizens from climate change, and I think that this is not true because many of us, for example, in Malaysia, many of our citizens have been affected greatly by the climate change. For example, like rising in temperature, and the government still focusing on that, but they are not they are not focusing more on reducing the low temperature because just as I said, the poor countries are not the major reason for the climate change. And also climate change is a difficult thing to control, especially for poor countries. Meanwhile, the developing countries, if, in general, changing curbing the climate change is very hard to control. But for poor countries, it's going to be very difficult. But for developing countries, they are able to do it. So because they have the great amount of resources to do that. Okay. So, all right. So just like I said before, the poor countries should be focused on other things other than climate change, other things than climate change. So therefore, making the policy to curb the climate change is going to be very difficult. It takes time to curb the climate change, especially for poor countries. The developing countries, uh, just like my second speaker just said, the developing countries they push away their responsibilities, even though they are the major reason to cause the climate change. And for example, like in like the countries in USA, they dispose the garbage to the Southeast Asian countries, which obviously the major effect of the climate change. So therefore, since the poor countries have been affected by the garbage disposal by the developing countries, therefore, so why should the poor countries should make the policy on that? They have to resolve the issue on that first, such as like garbage disposals, cleaning the garbage disposals, and much more. Therefore, the developing countries are much more what to say able to decrease the act of disposing the garbage and other unlawful acts that can affect the climate change. Right. Okay. And also the climate change, slowly, as we can see, the effect of climate change is the sea level rising and the rise of temperature. All right. So in Malaysia, we can see that sea level have been risen very drastically. Meanwhile, in developing countries, I've seen sea level rising can be seen like as like a little problem for them, right? Therefore, so they think that the sea level rises does not affect to the countries. Therefore, they think that they should not make the policy. However, since that developing countries are more, since that development countries are the major reason for the climate change. And the poor countries are affected by it. So I think that poor countries are not able to make the policies. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Government Whip. Last but not least, I welcome the Opposition Whip to the floor to deliver his speech.
Hello, am I clear? All right. So I prefer my POIs inaudible. Okay, I will not see any typings or raise of hands. So I will start in 3, 2, 1. Now, there are two things that the government insists on, which is firstly, it is the developed countries that are responsible to enact the policies regarding to the climate change, and the poor countries will not have no expenses, will prioritize more on their economy. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I want to ask the government, yes, when you push this policy to the developed countries, does that have any effect to the poor countries' climate change? Scientifically speaking, when the developed countries, use this green technology, use the tax and all of that, green tax, they are reducing their climate change on their pace. All right. For instance, carbon emission. When USA, reduces carbon emission, they are technically doing their policy to save climate change on their skies. But it does not have an effect to the poor countries, which in the end of the day still have those climate changes. All right. So as my side has stated, that we, the poor countries, are standing by ourselves. It doesn't matter if we push the policies to the developed countries, because there's nothing going to change in the poor countries, right? So, and when we are talking about expenses, it is true that logically or in reality, they would think of to increase their economy. But we need to understand that in the poor countries, their economy is based on two things, which is the infrastructures and the agriculture. Now, going to my rebuttals for the second speaker, all right, the second speaker from the government side say that, all right, we shouldn't focus on agriculture, we should focus on production. He gives examples in India. All right, let me ask you, what kind of production does not have, the main resources? Their main resources from the agriculture. All right, if you say that India, all right, what are their main production? You can say what? Their spices. Their spices came from agriculture. Their silk came from agriculture. So when they want to increase their economy, they need to realize that their agriculture is also important, and their agriculture can be destroyed in a severe way if they don't have the policy to curb the climate change. All right, I will get to you after this. Now, the second speaker from the government side say that we are shooting at our foot, but I think that we are actually killing two birds with one stone by the point that when the second speaker said about the poor countries needs to be focused on more like health insurance, infrastructure, we can reduce those expenses when we have the policy to curb the climate changes, because in these poor countries the climate changes is much more worse. So it will affect more on their health, it will affect more on their infrastructure. For example, when they have a flood, of course, lives are going to be lost. Many people are going to get injured, and more infrastructure are going to be destroyed. But if the flood is reduced, all of these things that I said that can be reduced, so the expenses towards those things can also be reduced. Okay, so I will take that POI. No, okay.
Wait, sorry.
So
you acknowledge the fact that there are countries dependent on infrastructure in order to develop the economy. If you acknowledge this fact, can you not also acknowledge the fact that some countries rely on their ability to increase their infrastructure through production in order to address their own economic issues?
Okay, so how are going to rely on the infrastructure if their infrastructure is constantly getting destroyed by these climate changes? I said flood, how about thunderstorm? They want to increase their infrastructure, but they can't do it because they need to repair it so often. They need to, because they don't have the measurements to prepare for these climate changes. The infrastructure cannot, be developed enough. All right, because like I said, when floods, they're going to get destroyed. When drought, the production is going to stop. Because why? Because another thing is, when we have these climate changes, it will also affect the people and it will also affect the production. So if Sister Atifa said we want to focus on production, how can we focus on production when people who are in the process, who are doing this production, cannot go to work because of these climate changes, because of the heat waves are too hot, because of the floods, they cannot go to it. So the productions technically will stop, and also the economically will stop. All right. So, and to point out that limited resources, yes, we don't actually, when we curb those policies, we don't actually tend to spend all of that on solar, on technology. We can also do other initiatives, such as my first speaker said, which is the green tax. All right, for every facility or every factory that emits a certain amount of smoke or carbon, they need to be taxed. So that way we can have expenses to to support us in this policy. And like I think I have heard the third speaker said Malaysia. For instance, Malaysia, we are not focusing more on the climate change, but we're also on developing. But it is a fact that in Malaysia we do have a policy regarding that. So I think there is aligns with my leader of what you say that poor countries need to do this within their capabilities, and in Malaysia capabilities we have, that is all we can do. So I think, yeah, Malaysia is one of the poor countries that do these policies because they know the importance and how can the climate change affect. All right, so now, just like I said, depending on developed countries and stating that we countries have, the poor countries have no expenses. In the long run, those things will never, the poor countries will never get the benefit from that, right? Compared to us, we win in the long run, all right? Because when we focus on policies to curb climate changes, we can actually increase our economy because of the factors that I have said just now. So with that, I end my case.
Now, it is time for the preparation of reply speeches. The time given for each team will be 4 minutes. Debaters, please use the 4 minutes to prepare your reply speeches.
Is it okay if we waive the 4 minutes and we just start reply speeches now?
Yeah.
So you're gonna start with your reply speeches right now?
Yeah. Is that okay?
Okay, sure.
Alright.
It is now time for the reply speeches, starting first with the opposition. Let's welcome the opposition team to make their summary.
Okay, I'm audible, right? Okay, starting my reply speech in 3, 2, 1. So I think that the reason as to why Gov loses this case is because I don't necessarily see how they've mentioned that like the resources are so limited to the point where these poor countries can't enact any kind of these policies. So 2 things mentioned by Gov, right? Number 1 is that you need to prioritize the economy, and number 2 is that rich countries have a bigger obligation, and as such, this obligation shouldn't be imputed to poor countries. Let's take this down one by one. Firstly, on their point that you need to prioritize the economy. Notice that up to this point in the debate, it's unclear as to why you need to choose one or the other. As of now, it is still Atifa's analysis, which is the sole analysis as to why you need to choose one or the other, which is that these poor countries have limited resources. But notice, right, Chair, that governments always work on a limited resource. Even rich countries, even though their revenue is like very high, their government expenditure is also very high, which means that the amount that they have to play around with is most likely somewhat similar to the amount that a poor country has to play around with. By definition, governments are always strict on budget. And as such, I don't necessarily clear why is it mutually exclusive as to why the like limited resources is that detrimental to the point where a poor country can't even enact any kind of like green policy whatsoever. But number 2, even if it is true that like it's limited so much so to the point where they can't enact any kind of policy, notice that this argument in and of itself assumes that there's no correlation between the economy and climate. By like Gov's own analysis, they concede that the most important thing to a developing country is most likely their economy. Notice that through like Hanani and like our third speaker, we've already proven to you as to why exactly that there's a direct correlation between the like climate and also the economy of the country. Insofar as this correlation has not been taken down by Gov's side, this is a legitimate link to prove, and as and acts as a justification as to why it's justified for us to probably sacrifice some sectors in order to actually promote the climate, because there's a direct correlation to the climate and also the economy. The second thing that they mentioned is that rich countries have a bigger obligation, and as such, the obligation shouldn't be imputed on poorer countries. A few problems with this, right? Number one, why exactly does imputing this obligation on poor countries suddenly take away the obligation from rich countries? I don't necessarily see a link up to this point. It's unexplained. And if it's going to be explained after this, I think that that's just new matter. Number one, notice that these two obligations is most likely going to be able to exist simultaneously, meaning to say that even though rich countries have an obligation, sure, they can enact their policies, but poorer countries also need to have this obligation to enact policies so that the climate crisis as a whole can most likely be settled off faster. But second thing, notice that if you were to actually impute this liability on poor countries, it's most likely that the obligation that you impute on rich countries is better enforced. Why is this so, right? It probably means that if poor countries are also doing their fair share to actually solve the climate crisis, but then rich countries are still polluting the climate, poorer countries are most likely going to form a bloc and actually go against rich countries, and this is going to be damn detrimental towards the rich countries, because now the rich countries don't have to allies of like poorer countries, and that's bad because usually that's where rich countries go for outsourcing their labor and their factories and stuff like that. But third thing is that notice that in Gov's world, if you were to push this burden solely on rich countries, you leave poor countries at the mercy of rich countries, meaning to say that you leave them vulnerable and expect them to enact green policies, which might not always be the case. And as such, the poor countries are still going to be harmed. What did we provide, right? We provided two things. Number one, we proved to you that poor countries are going to suffer more if they do not enact these policies. The reason as to why this argument is particularly important is that we can see that even though there's going to be some kind of economic harm that's going to be incurred by the poor country in enacting these policies, the scale of that harm is much larger if they were to ignore the climate crisis. But number two, notice that we painted out to you that the governments have a principal obligation to actually enact these kind of policies because they have an obligation to protect their citizens. Insofar as the citizens are dying of drought and flood, this is something which is bad, and as such, they're not discharging their principal obligation. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the speaker from the opposition team for the summary and welcome the last speaker from the government team to sum up for their team and the debate as a whole.
3, 2, 1. Notice how side opposition's case is in fact contingent on a couple of assumptions. Number one, that poor countries are not allowed to enact climate policies, something that we have repeatedly told them, that these people are able to enact these climate policies if they believe it is within their best interest. However, we do not believe that there should be an obligation in order for them to do so, due to the fact that they deserve and reserve the ability to prioritize those things which they feel may need better priority over climate change. Number two, they have assumed that all of these poor countries are dependent on agricultural factors. This is something that we have brought down from the very beginning, as we have stated, that there are some countries which are more dependent on things such as production and infrastructure, these things which they should be allowed to fully develop in order to bring better economic development. And number three, they assume that climate policies will always benefit the economy, but in reality, it is not. Due to the fact that we have proven to you that there is in fact the existence of a trade-off between the economy and climate change for a majority of these countries, and the fact that they have no choice but to push towards these climate change policies mean that they have to reduce their resources towards other policies such as combating corruption, or increasing their production. Now, ladies and gentlemen, there are two major questions which need to be answered by both sides of the floor here today. Number one, which side better caters? Oh my God. Number one, which side better caters to curbing climate change? And number two, which side better aids development? Now, on the topic of climate change and which side better combats it, the opposition side has stated over and over again that these poor countries should produce, at least within their capacity, an effort to combat climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, we have stated again and again that in terms of responsibility, in terms of who was the biggest responsibility, we have stated that these climate issues have been historically produced by these developed countries due to the Industrial Revolution. We believe that due to the fact that they have benefited more from the pollution that we are currently suffering from, they should therefore hold a larger responsibility. And we have also proven to you that by narrowing down the number of countries which are being held responsible for climate change, we are increasing this pressure at an international scale, and therefore in the long term, better combating climate change, because the countries which have more resources and expertise, a better ability to combat climate change, have no choice but to do more due to the fact that the responsibility is being pushed towards them. In their world, they're living in a world in which these countries do not have such a large pressure due to the fact that this pressure is dispersed over a larger number of countries, and therefore, they are able to basically half-ass this ability to curb climate change. On our side, we acknowledge whose fault it is and who should hold the big responsibility. Second, we have stated that it doesn't necessarily need to be expensive. This is a huge assumption on their side, as we fail to acknowledge the scale as to which these policies need to be enacted in order to bring around a sustainable change. And even if they do choose to enact these policies on these smaller scales, these are policies which are difficult to sustain. Now, number two, which side better is development? They've stated that these countries are development on infrastructure and agriculture. Again, a huge assumption. Our side government has acknowledged the fact that states may suffer from other things, such as low production, labor issues, corruption, so on and so forth. These are things which deserve to be prioritized over climate change. They've stated over and over again that these things can intertwine, that they can occur simultaneously. That sometimes, if countries work on climate change, they can also better the economy in terms of things such as agriculture. That they can combat things such as floods, so on and so forth. As we've stated again and again, we have repeated that if they want to, they can. If it is within their best interest, they reserve this ability to continue to do this climate change. However, we believe that this pressure at an international scale, that this obligation is something which is in fact detrimental both to the climate and also to these countries' development and economy. We believe that these are things which need to be prioritized in the case of these poor countries, and therefore side government wins. Thank you.
Thank you to all the speakers for the great debate. Dearest Judge, you have a maximum of 10 minutes to give your verbal adjudications. The floor is now yours, dear Judge.
Hi everyone, I'm back. Checking if I'm audible and if all the teams are here. Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes, we
Government
can
is
hear.
here.
Alright, it's up here.
Yep.
Yes, we hear.
Okay, cool. I will give OA right now. I'm assuming all of Gov and all of Op is here and I'm perfectly audible, yeah? Okay.
Yeah.
Alright. Starting my OA in 3, 2, 1. Hi everyone, welcome back to round 1 of the Rector's Cup. Thank you for the first round. I thought it was a good debate and I came to a conclusion. But this is how my OA is going to go. Firstly, I'm going to give general feedbacks, and then second, I'm going to give you the results, and lastly, I'll be justifying why I came to such decision. But first, general feedback will only be one, and it is to engage with each other. And this means to, for every single debater, to try and take and accept POIs. I recognize, I think most of the debaters did that. But for the development of the case, I would prefer for each of the debater to try to take and also accept POIs, as it helps in the development of each cases, because you don't want your case to constantly be what you want to give, but rather to also engage with what the opposition or your opposition side is trying to push to you. So it is important for you to also engage in POIs, because that is the mere chance for them to be interacting with you firsthand. So that's it for general feedback. Now moving on to the results. Yep, after consideration, I give the win to side opposition. So that is a win to side opposition. Yeah. And now I'll be moving on to the justification as to am I audible?
Yeah, no, you are.
Yes.
Sorry, I assume that was a yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So just repeating, I give the win to side op. Here are three clashes I identified in the debate. Firstly, its capability to make change in the efforts of combating climate change in and of itself. Secondly, is whether you have to forego your economic development in trying to combat climate change. And lastly, on whether or not giving obligation to rich countries actually affects your stance in like poorer countries having to, whether or not poor countries have to be obliged to like help curb climate change. So firstly, on the capability to make change in combating climate change. So in government, PM specifically tried to push the fact that even if we do have to like we do have the obligation to input some sort of effort in combating climate change, there will not be a substantial effect on climate change in and of itself, because they do not produce as much carbon emission or as much responsibility in actually deteriorating the climate in general. But then I thought, firstly is the fact that that only came from PM but was not continued throughout the whole bench, was one factor that it could not stand. But it's also the fact that opposition also then came in, that because poorer countries are in larger number in comparison to richer countries in general, like globally, if poorer countries, even though have to make an effort in their own comfort zone, meaning that they do not have to make large efforts, but if they do input small efforts, but each country are obliged to make efforts, at the end of the day, it will make a substantial amount. Hence, when both benches do agree the fact that at the end of the day, climate change is important, which was not reflected in like government, by the way. Like government did not put on a scale that, oh, economic development, climate change is not as important as sorry, climate climate change is not as important as economic development. So I assume that both benches agree that at the end of the day, climate change is important. So in the scale of whether or not you will make an impact on combating climate change, at the end of the day, you will. So um this clash goes on to opposition as they manage to prove that whether or not the effort is small or large, you will at the end of the day make change. 1 second. All right, second clash then on whether or not like involving climate change is bad for the economics, or like whether or not you have to forego your economic development if you actually try to combat climate change. Well, government came in, and I felt like the whole thrust of the government bench was saying that the government in and of itself, or like poorer countries, have limited resources, hence actually combating climate change is not within their capacity. And I felt like um interested in like all the other speakers speeches, as you tried to say that or richer countries then have their responsibility. So what you want to say is that the economics have to be forgotten if you do try to like combat climate change. But what OP came in and said is the fact that firstly rich countries also have limited resources, because at the end of the day they also have big expenditures. So in the scale of having limited resources, both sides actually do have limited resources, but it's also the fact that opposition came in and say most poor countries actually depend on like climate change to actually grow their economy. So if you do, so it's not a matter of like you have to prioritize one or the other. It's the fact that climate change is actually important for you to be able to sustain your economy at the end of the day. There were some things that came from government that said if you let's say that, oh no, not all poor countries have to depend on agriculture, etc., but those were actually the outliers. You need to tell me, if you do want this example to fly, you need to tell me why even without agriculture these poorer countries will be able to sustain their economy without like having to depend on climate change. So you have to give me like solid structural reasons why like India don't have to depend on spices, or like they actually don't depend on their agricultural like field in general for them to like succeed, things like that. Yeah. So even, and this was the particular clash that I felt was heavily important, and this clash also was won through opposition. And lastly, on the third clash on whether or not rich countries have the obligation, and I think this was not as an important clash as it should be, but it was thoroughly debated. So I have to also add this upon. But before that, 1 second. So sorry. So third clash was whether or not rich countries have the obligation to actually do this. But note that this was not something that had to be debated, because of the fact that it doesn't matter whether or not rich countries have the obligation, because it doesn't change the dynamic towards whether or not poor countries um have to contribute into this climate change whole combating thing, right? But also I tried to like take certain points from government when you said that if rich countries have the obligation, that at the end of the day there will be no pressure on poorer countries, and like poorer countries don't have to like bust their asses to actually make this combating climate change thing like their whole focus, right? But then up also came in on the fact that the dynamic of the poor and also rich countries actually do change if they don't make like any sort of effort. And that is because of the fact that when they actually have to depend on richer countries to solely focus on combating climate change, this also means policies will not like truly help them at the end, help these poorer countries at the end of the day. But also secondly, this also means that at the end of the day, the poorer countries have to like will definitely have to depend on richer countries, and that at the end of the day is not a good thing to look up on. So these were the three clashes that I actually did this particular debate on. All three clashes went to opposition. If you do have any like questions or uncertainties, feel free to like approach me now, or even on WhatsApp, I think, for like personal feedback. Thank you.
Thank you.
Congratulations to all debaters and thank you to our judge. We will continue the next session at 2:15 p.m. Thank you and Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you.
Waalaikumsalam.
Good
Thank you.
debate.
Thank you, everyone.